Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Fitness Lit Breakdown. I'm your host, Dr. Nick Truby. Now, as always, I appreciate you sharing your time with me and your interest in all things science and exercise. Now, I always also appreciate if you leave any comments or ratings or share this with your friends, because the ultimate goal of this podcast is to reach as many people as possible so that they may implement these tools that we talk about each week in their everyday lives and their exercise programs. All right, so this week's episode is an interesting paper that I'm reviewing because I have an interest in this, and it deals with functional training and comparing that style of training to traditional resistance training. So we're really looking at with this investigation is a very short time period. It was only 5 weeks of direct comparison between functional training and traditional resistance training on specific anthropometric, that's kind of measurements of your body, specific measurements of your body like height, weight, percent body fat, those types of things, and motor performance variables. So we looked at things like balance and speed and jumping ability, more power creating type activities. Now, if you don't know much about motor, and the term that's typically used is either motor control or motor learning, those aren't exactly the same thing. But when you think of what motor is, there are two really underlying principles that allow us to understand. And when we start talking about how functional training changes these become very important. So the first of which is sensation, our body's natural capacity to sense things in our environment. And we do this from very specialized receptors that can be located in the skin or internally within the body. Some are even kinesioreceptors, meaning kind of awareness in space of specific joints or limbs, or even our center of mass in our body where that's located over time, especially during movement and exercise. So the sensation piece is, if you want to think about it in a more simple term, is providing feedback from our environment into our central nervous system. And from there, the central nervous system can decide the priority of how important this data is or information is to decide what to do with it. So we're not going to dive down that rabbit hole. It's a very interesting topic, but from our standpoint of today, it's using those environmental sensation pieces as a way to understand what's going on in our environment so we can manipulate how we move. The second component of motor is perception. And that's almost, if you want to think about it as we did before with sensation, perception is almost feed-forward response. When you think about sensation or perception in this context, it's a way to build off of previous experience. So a couple of really good examples that give you a great idea of perception is if you've ever played catch, right? And let's say you're out in the yard and you're throwing a baseball or a softball or a tennis ball. Each of those three, number one, are different sizes. Each of those three are different weights. And when you think about throwing that ball back and forth with your friend, whoever it might be, your hand somehow knows after 5 or 6 throws how much to cushion the ball when you catch it. It doesn't just hit your hand and just not fall straight down. You kind of cushion the ball, your arm goes back as you catch the ball. Now, how in the world did you know how much to cushion, how large the ball was, how to orient your hand in space to catch it at the exact moment, to not injure your hand or catch it efficiently? Now, that really goes back to that perception effect, in that with over repeated trials, you've understood through those sensation factors how heavy the ball is, how large it is, how much your hand has to close around it to catch it efficiently. So these two really work together in that the sensation provides the feedback, perception applies the feed forward. So it's always a conversation between the two and really working together on the best way to achieve an action and to do it most efficiently, especially when we talk about movement. Okay, other behaviors we can dive into differently, but we're talking specifically with movement, and even more specifically, the difference between traditional resistance training and functional training. All right. So let's keep those in mind as we continue to talk about this paper. Now, you probably heard the term, it was a hot topic probably 5 years ago. It really started to emerge in kind of culture or popular culture, that term functional training. Now, at the basis of all training really, but even more specifically with functional training, the SAID principle, S-A-I-D. And the SAID principle is specific adaptation to impose demands. And that's just a very fancy kind of specialized way of saying whatever we're doing specifically, we're expecting based off of that demand, a very specific adaptation to occur to our physiology. Speaking specifically to training, exercise training. And with functional training, what we're really trying to do is analyze and assess all of very specific movement tasks a person may have, whether it be in their sport, whether it be in their hobbies, whether it be in their activities, whether it even be as specific as things like a manual labor type of position, if that's the career path that you may be working in. We look at all those movements and we understand them at a very basic level, what those movements look like, which muscle groups are being used, what planes of motion are we using, how are we rotating, how are we orienting our body in space, and taking those movements from that external environment and making them specific in a training setting. So they may not look exactly like if you're looking at just the exercises that may be prescribed as functional training. They're probably not going to look, like your traditional barbell bench press or squat, things like that. They may look and translate to, or even imitate is likely the best word to use. We're trying to imitate the movements in a training setting that can improve those characteristics in the battlefield, if you will, right? In the person's job, in the person's task they complete on a daily basis, in the person's, skill of a certain sport. So really trying to be as specific as possible, even more so in regards to kind of the external environment, AKA your job, your field, whatever you're doing. So that really was originally developed, and it kind of makes sense, not really so much in the sporting world, but more so in the aging population. Because as we age, our physiology naturally degrades if we're not really keeping up with, through the lifespan, physical activity and exercise. We start to see decrements or decreases in our overall motor capacity. So both that perception and the sensation piece and how they work together, those are not as sharp as well as the actual physiology, the nerves within the muscle that talk to the muscle, right? The connection between your brain and the muscle itself. All those things start to see decrements as well. So it's kind of a double whammy in that if we're not really, the best way to describe it is if you don't use it, you lose it, right? I know it sounds kind of silly, but that is really the best way to explain aging in our overall capacity to do functional type movements or just task specific movements in general. So functional training was originally developed in that population and to really try and reverse, if possible, the decrements we see with aging. So we're trying to improve things like balance, trying to improve things like kinesthetic awareness, like where is your limb in regards to your hips, right? So where are your limbs in space? How can you be more efficient and effective with movement? How can we train not to fall? How can we train to maintain your capacity for strength or power as you age? So that was really the initial kind of guidance for functional training where it was used in a human type setting. And when we look at it even further, some of the original studies that were done in this field were in aging women, and they looked more specifically at could these ladies maintain their own kind of independence as they continued to age. And their functional task ability, this may have been, I didn't look and dive into the original study here, but likely this would have been, tasks like reaching into a cabinet to get a glass out from, the kitchen, or being able to do gardening and yard work, or getting things out of a trunk of a car. So very, specific tasks that, healthy people don't really even think about. They just kind of do. But when you start to lose the ability, then it becomes a big issue. So functional training has been shown to really improve that. It's also interesting, some of these studies, this is over a decade ago, I'm kind of citing here, so it's a little out of date, but I'm sure there's been more in this population for sure. Post-stroke patients, where they may have lost some capacity of their limbs, or just overall strength, or just that motor connection between the brain and muscle that's sometimes has been shown to be obviously, decreased as well. So they found that functional training may actually be more likely to improve these things compared to just a traditional resistance training. So some of these movements we'll talk about once we dive into the study here a little bit, what those functional specific movements are compared to like, you know, going to a gym-based setting and sitting on a machine and just doing, you know, very linear type exercise. It would make sense when you think about it in that sense, that they're very specific to a task compared to very specific in improving a isolated muscle group. Okay, keep that in mind. All right, so we also looked at, in this setting, you have to keep in mind what type of participants are being studied in any of these type. I mean, we talk about this every week, but even more so in this setting, what kind of participants are being used? Are they totally untrained, never really exercised structurally before? Are they very trained individuals? Because that is going to dictate what kind of adaptations or improvements we're going to see in these variables. So if you take a very fit person who's done functional training along with resistance training and kind of a broad scope of that, we're likely not going to see much difference in things like balance or coordination, because our tools that we're using to measure them with aren't finite enough to see those small changes. We need a person that hasn't really trained as much, or a person of older age who hasn't trained as much, to actually see if this is a really great methodology to improve these factors. So keep that in mind, because the beginner will have more improvements compared to the more trained person. Now I'm saying that because they're citing previous research stating that these unstable functional type movements most of the time they are appropriately citing this here, use lower overall forces to complete the movement. We're not loading this person with X number of pounds on a bar or a barbell or a dumbbell. Most of these can be body weight. Some of these can be, you know, unstable type surfaces or even suspension, you know, TRX type exercises. Some can even be, you know, holding weight only on one side of the body and nothing on the other side to create that unbalanced type environment. So overall, there is lower forces being required, and that does improve, you know, strength and balance specifically. But if you're in a beginner type setting, and this can be used in your training or someone you may be training or working with as well, if you have a person that is a beginner, even though functional training tends to be lower overall force being applied to the person, it is very much so reliant on the person's posture and body awareness and overall coordination of all those things. So if you have a person that may not be an expert with their personal posture, that may not have amazing posture, that may not have a lot of experience doing these types of movements, yes, the forces are lower, which usually means less likelihood for injury, things like that, or overworking. You have to have some balance, some postural control to do these well and to maintain technique. So be a little leery in how you start to apply these type of movements in your own training if you're not 100% confident in your overall posture to begin with. So hopefully that makes sense. I think that's a really good background for what functional training is at its core and how it really differentiates itself from traditional resistance training. So let's take a look at this investigation specifically. The overall aim of this study was to determine training specific effects, so they're being very specific with what kind of things they're looking at, of functional training versus traditional resistance training. And they're looking at specific anthropometric measures, like I mentioned before. We'll talk about what those are. And then indicators of things like power, strength, agility, sprint performance, and jumping ability. Now, I know what you're saying. If you know, you're not jumping and you're not worried about how high you can jump and how quickly you can do it, which personally I'm not really either. These things that we can pull from this study, the results we can pull from this, really do speak to how we can train specifically for our physiology, no matter how old we are. It doesn't necessarily have to be jumping specific. So keep that in mind too. So here we need to understand first who were the subjects in this study. They were all males, and they were all kind of undergraduate / graduate kinesiology majors. And they were all between the age of 22 and 25. So if you want to think about who this really best represents, obviously it's a male 22 to 25-year-old, and they were all trained people who have had experience in traditional resistance training. So not really the best representation of a large population as a whole, but like I said before, we can take some of these data that they talk about and discuss and apply to essentially any age group in any population. But these are going to be specific, these data will be specific to that group. When we look at their capacity for how much they've actually done, functional training wise, all I'm getting here is they have a limited experience. So maybe just some experience here and there with their training, mostly of which is going to be geared more towards traditional resistance training. So that being said, we should see some differences, even though they are a trained population, trained being more so geared towards consistently doing traditional resistance training, not much in the field of functional training. So that kind of we can foreshadow a little bit that we're going to see some differences in that group based on functional training. Now they also did, here's the biggest kicker, it was 5 weeks long. So it wasn't a very long intervention exercise protocol. Over 5 weeks, if you have a trained population, I mean, it would have to be something vastly different and of a very probably high intensity geared alongside of a very hardcore nutritional type protocol to really see differences in some of these variables they're looking at. So the timeline wasn't very large, and they only were doing these very specific protocols for 3 days per week. So overall, they only really, had 15 exercise sessions. Between half of those, the group of males in the study, half of those were assigned to that traditional resistance training group, half were assigned to functional training. So keep that in mind as well, because that's going to kind of determine how much we're actually going to see change-wise of really less than, not even, barely over a month and a week of training. So what were some of the anthropometric? Anthropometric is really just measurements of the person's body. And we can be as specific as body weight and height. We can be as specific as body mass index. We can even talk about their percent body fat. And specifically they looked at body height, body mass, and percent body fat with this. And they also looked at things like lean body mass. They just did an easy calculation of their of their overall weight and their percent body fat and did some easy calculations there to figure out how much was actual fat mass and how much was the rest. And we call that lean body mass. We tracked that at the beginning and tracked that at the end of the 5 weeks. The agility measures that were looked at was a shuttle run. So think back to your high school days, or if you're a professional athlete listening to this, you start at a kind of a middle point and you turn and run 5 meters, stop, turn, run back 10 meters, stop, turn back, and run 5 meters to where you started. So you've overall ran 20 meters total, but you've changed direction multiple times. So it's a good way of looking at agility, in that agility assessing your ability to kind of get up and go, but at the same time, decelerate, stop, and then accelerate in an opposite direction. So agility in that sense. Another test was the Hexagon Test. Now this is normally done with, you basically make a very specific hexagon with tape or chalk on the floor, and you start off in the middle of the hexagon, and you jump over, forward, and jump back into the middle. That's jump one. And then you do that for each one of the sides of the hexagon. And you typically do this multiple times, usually 2 to 3 times around in that cycle, typically clockwise, and without making errors, and you judge how quickly the person did it. So it's a time-based. So really good, another great way to track and measure agility, being that you're starting and stopping, changing directions, accelerating, decelerating, all in one test. If you've ever done that before, it's pretty cool. If not, you can do a quick Google search and check out and see how it's actually done. They also did a few sprint variables. So sprinting is a great way to assess kind of lower body power in a sense, because it's how quickly can you go from one location to the next. And if you recall power from our first episode, I believe, force times distance divided by time. If you decrease the amount of time you're doing that, applying that force over that distance, you improve or increase your overall power output. So they track this is the easy way to track power, because obviously it's stopwatch, how fast did you run that distance. They looked at a few more things, 2 of which were medicine ball based exercises. One was a standing medicine ball toss. So the person stood with very erect posture, facing forward, hips facing forward, shoulders facing forward, feet about hip width apart, and they threw a 1 kilogram, that's 2.2 pounds, medicine ball with one arm, their dominant arm, and they didn't do a step forward like you would typically see in something like throwing a baseball or whatever, but they were basically told how quickly Oh, they weren't, never mind, they were permitted, sorry. I'm misquoting the paper here. But subjects were permitted to step forward over the line after they had thrown the ball. So that basically they didn't step and throw like a traditional baseball or softball throw. They were able to throw, and then their momentum of their body could move forward, and they could then step over the line. So it's a great way to measure kind of spinal and core stability, being able to maintain a rigid, from hips to shoulders position as you're moving your limbs around that. So they kind of threw it. If you're sitting here watching it on my YouTube channel, they sat here and threw it, and then if they had their momentum, they could move forward with their momentum and step over the line. The other one was lying down on their back, and their knees were bent and feet flat on the floor, and arms were fully extended over their head. And they were throwing with two hands a 3-kilogram medicine ball, which is 6.6 pounds, if I'm doing my math correctly. And it was almost like a soccer throw-in, but lying on the floor, and saw how far they could throw that 6.6 pound medicine ball. So 2 ways to really measure, which they called explosive strength, which is just power of basically the core and upper body. The last of which they looked at explosive strength, and which is essentially power. They use different terminology because I think they were reporting this out of Croatia, so they may just use explosive strength as a basically way of saying power. They had like a way of measuring different variables using like a vertical jump mat. And this mat is hooked to a power source and a computer system, and you jump on this mat, and it tells you things like how high you jumped, how much force you pushed into the ground, which that's how much force you would then obviously lift off with, how much contact time you had with your feet on the ground, because that's indicative of power as well. So all kinds of cool measurements you can take from that with this mat. So they did a counter movement vertical jump where they stood probably with their feet about hip width apart. They kind of squatted down, do like a quarter squat, and then they jumped up as high as they could to get that vertical jump height. They measured all kinds of variables with that. So those were their main data collection points, and they wanted to see which group actually saw better improvements depending on if they did functional training or traditional resistance training. So let's take a look at their exercises, because this is kind of fun to look at. And all these, keep in mind too, all of these exercises between groups were matched for type of movement and number of upper body and lower body movements. So for example, the traditional resistance training group had session A and session B. They just kind of went back and forth on these sessions. But just for example, session A, they did a free weight squat, a T-bar row, a bench press, and a hamstring curl machine. Okay, so they had a squat, hamstring curl, so 2 lower body. They did a row and a press. So 2 lower body exercises, a push and a pull upper body. Compared to session A of the functional training group, was mainly using a TRX, which if you've ever used one of those, and I'm not endorsing these either, I'm not getting paid by TRX to talk about them, but essentially a suspension trainer. In session A for the functional training group did a 1-leg TRX squat. So they put, I believe they held on to, they have pictures here. Now they put their 1 foot in the straps, and they did a single leg squat with 1 foot in the strap. So that is their squat compared to the free weight squat of the resistance training group. They performed a suspension row, so a TRX row, 2-armed row, that matches the T-bar row of the other group. They performed a TRX push-up, so you're leaning forward in that push-up position, and you do a push-up with both hands in the straps of your TRX. That is essentially trying to mimic or do a similar movement to the bench press, barbell bench press. And they did a power wheel leg flexion, they called it. And that's basically like an ab wheel. You've probably seen an ab wheel in a gym setting. Well, they lied on their back and put their feet on the handles, and they rolled their heels to their butts, basically. Did a hamstring curl with that. So a body weight means of doing a hamstring curl. But there is a lot more, if you just notice the difference between the two. These groups, you're fixed in a certain position, or lying fixed in a certain position, or in a machine in a fixed position in the traditional resistance training group. Compared to the functional training group, you had much more stability involved in that you're using a suspension TRX trainer, you're using the ab wheel, which is, it sounds simple, but if you ever try to do a hamstring curl, that wheel doesn't always want to come in a straight line back to your hips. It can be very curvy, if you will, if you're not focusing on being intentional with the path you're using on that hamstring curl. So much more stability involved compared to the overall strength that you're really focusing on the traditional group. So those are the biggest differences I'm seeing here. On top of the resistance training group was told a very specific intensity to use and amount of repetitions to apply that intensity. So each one of these group members in the traditional resistance training group were lifting at 80% of their 1 rep max, and they were suggested or told to try and get 6 to 10 reps at that resistance over 4 sets. Okay, so usually around 80% of your 1 RM, your 1 rep max, you're probably going to get right around that 8 plus or minus reps. Okay, so they were pretty spot on there. The biggest difference and almost an inherent flaw with the way they used their functional training in this setting was that they were basically told to self-administer intensity. And this kind of is hard to really justify and organize when you try to look at the results and the data that comes from this, because we can't really say that each person was working at the same relative intensity, right? They all weren't working at a certain percentage of the 1 rep max. It was how far do they want to lean that day on the TRX row, that kind of stuff, right? But they were told to do 8 to 12 repetitions of each of those exercises. So you can likely see some differences already between the two. All right, so let's dive into some of the details of the results, because this is where it really tells us some differences and how you can apply this in your training and try and take away some of these golden nuggets here. So when you look at the two groups, there were some small differences. Some of these were maybe just fun to point out. Others were actually statistically significant, meaning the actual training protocol was responsible for the differences and not just random statistical error. One that's kind of fun to look at, and they didn't run a statistics on this, which I'm kind of disappointed they didn't do, but the group that did the functional training between the start at day 0 and the end at end of 5 weeks, they measured their body height, right? And you wouldn't think a group of males between the ages of 22 and 25 would grow, but they, on average, the actual saw an increase in 1.2 centimeters, which is just slightly under 1/2 inch. So I'm going to say that this group probably didn't grow 1/2 inch. And I mean, this could have been the researchers came in after a hard night of drinking the night before, who knows, and did some measurements and got this. But I'm going to attribute it to, because this is a main difference I tend to see in my practice, and I've seen in many other studies as well, and that functional training and just the core stability component of it and how intentional you have to be with some of these movements, overall posture improves. And with that, we're gaining height just through improved posture. So we can think of this as better engagement of the abs, right? We can look at this as better engagement of the glutes. We could look at this as better engagement of those postural muscles around the shoulder and upper spine. And if you engage all of those and are doing a better job of being able to recruit and get those muscles working while you're standing, your posture is going to be much better, therefore you will get taller. So that's a great takeaway finding for me, even though they didn't really talk about it much in the study. I think that's an awesome finding that everybody can apply in their own scope of practice, that if they're really functioning or focusing on some of these stability type, suspension type movements, or even offset, which they did. Offset being they held weight only in one hand and did their lunge or things like that. They saw improvements in posture, which that's a nice little takeaway message you can use in your training. All right, so the biggest difference they saw, there's only a couple for each group. In the traditional resistance training group, keep in mind this was only 5 weeks long, and these are all trained subjects. They saw improvements in ground contact time. So during that max vertical jump movement, they decreased their overall contact time with the ground, meaning the less time you're in contact with the ground, the more force you're producing away from the ground. Compared to if you spend more time on the ground, you're basically cushioning the amount of force into the ground and producing less force when you jump. So a decreased ground contact time means more force is going up, therefore you've increased your power. Decrease the time, you always increase the power. The last one was their peak power measure. And that also, as part of that power component of the vertical jump, in both these being lower body type improvements in overall power. And that makes sense for me right away, because when you looked at the difference in overall training load or intensity, whichever word you'd like to use, they were using 80% of their 1 rep max for those hamstring curls and for those squats. And the other session they did involved things like lunges and deadlifts and things like that. They were using 80% of the 1 rep max for 4 sets. That alone is going to improve overall strength, which even though strength doesn't immediately mean you're going to get more powerful, but if you just look at the equation simply, force times distance, the distance is basically like, if you want to think of a bench press, how far you're pressing the bar. The force is how much weight you're lifting, right? And the time element. So even if you didn't improve the time, let's just say, just for this example, let's say you only improved your overall strength, you didn't improve anything with power. You're able to lift 100 pounds, 0.5 meters in 2 seconds. So 100 times 0.5, that's 50 to 25. So your reading was 25, right? Now let's say you can do, just to keep the math simple, 200 pounds over 0.5 meters in 2 seconds. You just doubled your power even without improving the time, because overall strength improved. So one way to improve power is to sometimes improve strength, okay? And also, obviously the best way to improve power is to train for power. So keep that in mind too. So they improved their lower body power, likely just because they were using a higher overall training load compared to the functional training group. The functional training group saw a few improvements, both of which were more coordination and posture specific improvements. So the first one was the standing medicine ball throw, the one where they're, again, if you're watching this, they're standing kind of in a plank type position, very rigid, shoulders back, abs engaged, and they have that 1 kilogram ball that they're throwing, and they wind back and they throw that baby as far as they can, allowing their body weight and momentum to move forward, but not stepping and throwing. That's very indicative of your ability to, keep a very rigid torso, because think of it as like this, almost like your torso is a rubber band. If you have a very flimsy rubber band and you stretch it slightly, you don't get very much recoil, right? You're holding it in your hand and you kind of have the rubber band around your pointer finger and your thumb, and you stretch it out and you kind of, pull it back and flick it, and it just goes 2 feet away from you. Now, on the flip side, let's say you've got a really thick, robust rubber band. You put that around your pointer finger, index finger, and your thumb, and you pull it back and you let that thing go, and all of a sudden it shoots across the room. So your trunk does the same exact thing in a mechanism like throwing, in that we can store more of that potential energy as you rotate and wind back. You're stretching a more rigid type rubber band. Therefore, you're going to get much more force when you let the ball go. That's the same thing that happened in this setting, in that the functional training group had a better capacity to recruit abdominal type muscles and more core related, posture related muscles based off of improvements they saw in their training. And that doesn't surprise me, because if you've ever done any this type of functional training as they're defining it here, with unstable surfaces or suspension trainers, or holding weight on one side and not the other, and really working on that postural component, those are benefits you get from that style of training. The other was the Hexagon Test. Their Hexagon Test was essentially faster, and their improvement got much faster compared to the traditional resistance training group. And that kind of goes back to all those unstable surfaces. So using the proprioceptive, where your body is in space and how your muscles are firing and telling all that information to the brain, from all those one-legged type exercises or suspension type exercise, where you're really having to focus on balance. We're seeing improvements in that. So the Hexagon Test would make sense, because you're jumping in all different directions and you're starting and stopping and changing directions. So that style of training, compared to being locked in a machine, locked in a lying position, probably not going to improve those proprioceptive, kinesthetic type of variables compared to traditional resistance training. So those are the biggest differences in this study. And we have to recall and remember that when you look at a exercise program in general, this is going to be used for your practice or somebody you're working with, or just anything that goes along with exercise. Most of your repeatable, reputable exercise programs that are geared towards longevity and sustainability are likely going to have a mix of traditional type resistance training, a mix of functional training movements, a mix of body weight movements, a mix of aerobic type exercise, all encompassing a more well-rounded type exercise. So I'm not recommending that you do one or the other and specifically just do that. because we're missing a lot of gaps in your physiology that you could be improving. Especially just talking to the everyday average person walking around that's wanting to improve overall fitness and overall functional capacity of being able to go out and mow their lawn and do yard work and go to work and come back and coach a kid's game, you know, in terms of being that type of physical fit. Because there's obviously different types of physical fit that you can be out there. So keep that in mind too, that this is more of a fully encompassing one that I'm preaching right now, and that it should probably have elements of all different types. I'm a huge proponent of functional training. I use it personally. I prescribe it a lot in my clients I work with, but I also prescribe the others that we just talked about because they all each have their own purpose. So obviously there were some limitations to this study because I like to rationalize the data that I read and try and make sense of it to a larger group of population, right? Because you might be working, or I might be working with a 25-year-old, or I might be working with a 75-year-old, and to take these data and run with it. So obviously a small sample size and a small age group range, they were all trained people, so but they weren't super trained in functional training, so that's something to keep in mind as well. So we didn't see as many improvements, but this group was able to do those type of functional training movements because they were stronger in those type of postural areas as well. So I wouldn't just throw a beginner out and have them do some of these TRX exercises or offset unbalanced exercises because obviously they're not totally there yet. So smaller sample size, it was only 5 weeks in duration. So how much can we really see in 5 weeks? Something along the lines of, you know, a few more, 8 weeks at minimum, maybe 10 or 12 would have been better to see what changes could have really been there to begin with between variables and between groups, and how much of those, you know, differences would we have seen could have been different as well. Probably the biggest inherent flaw we all talked about before was no way to try and figure out a way to get the intensity of the functional training group the same within the group, because they were told to self-administer the intensity. All told to get the same amount of reps, so reps was the same. So, but you know, how much were they leaning on a TRX row? How far do they go down in the squat and sit back into the strap of the TRX single leg squat? You know, all that kind of stuff. So that is going to be a little bit different compared to everybody doing 80% of their 1 rep max for X number of reps. So that's the biggest difference there too. All right, so that is our chat about differences between resistance training in a traditional sense and using functional training and what you can expect from those very specific variables, mainly speaking more towards posture, postural control, balance and coordination, and then strength. So if you're wanting to improve lower body strength and likely upper body strength as well to a certain extent, traditional resistance training is by far the best way to do so, and that may even coordinate to improving power. And if you want to increase things like motor control, postural control, right, being able to maintain posture through movement, proprioception and balance, and agility, which is important even as we age, being able to even catch ourselves from falls or maneuver around certain objects in our environment, all those things come into play. So that's where you can see right away where a combination of the two is really the ideal setting for a well and overall encompassing workout program. Thank you again for tagging along. If you have any recommendations for a future podcast episode, I'd love to see it in the comments. If you wouldn't mind giving a review for this podcast, because the more reviews this podcast can receive, the more ratings we can get, the more and greater of audience we can reach. So I always appreciate any feedback you would like to give. Thank you again for your interest in all things science and exercise, and come back next week for episode 5 of Fitness Lit Breakdown.